coming home from Nashville where he was attending the Lads to Leaders Convention. So a week ago last Wednesday, he covered for me while I was under the weather, and so tonight I'm covering for Mark. We'll try to do his notes justice. Get the slides going. Family Matters. We'll continue with Mark's study on looking at different families, coming mostly from the Old Testament. And we'll talk about Noah tonight. So let's put some time frame to it. I heard the comment made that Noah and Adam probably lived at the same time. My study from Genesis chapter 5 actually does not support that, but they were close. So Adam was 130 when Seth was born. And then Seth had Enosh, Enosh had Kenan, Kenan had Mahalalel, Mahalalel had Jared, Jared had Enoch, Enoch had Methuselah, Methuselah had Lamech, and Lamech's son was Noah. So if you look at Genesis chapter 5, that covers a time period of about 1,056 years. But Noah and Adam would have missed each other by about 126 years. So Adam had died about 126 years before Noah was born. Seth had died about 10 years before Noah was born. So how many generations? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 generations from Adam to Noah. That's a long time. It's 1,000 years plus. It's a long time, but as I was thinking through Mark's slides and I was thinking about the context of Adam through the generations to Noah, it's 1,000 years, 1,056 years. You know, I don't know where my family history 1,000 years ago, I have no idea. I'm not sure I could even trace it back past my great-grandfather, my great-grandparents. I do know my father's grandmother was Cherokee Indian. That's as far back as I could go. So 1,000 years is really a long time in a way. But you have to think about Adam being created and then all of the development of mankind as man populated the earth across those generations. And how we got from Adam and Eve in the garden to the sin in the garden, Adam and Eve being expelled, ultimately winding up in 1,000 years, reaching the point where man had become so wicked that God, in his righteous judgment, chose to wipe man from the face of the earth, all living creatures. And he did that through the flood, except for Noah and his family. So I'd like to start to think about Noah and keep these questions in mind that you see on the screen, right? So be thinking always in the back of your mind, the family structure. What were the roles within the family? Noah's family here for our context tonight, the relationship and the dynamics between those family members, what might have been the advantages of the family being structured the way it was, what challenges or problems did the family face, either because of the structure or, in Noah's case, because of the condition that the world had come into by the time Noah is walking around. Also, I think Mark wants us to always keep in mind that families are unique. All families have a history, some for better, some for worse. I think everybody sort of chuckles. We do in my family. We've got that uncle, you know who I'm talking about. But the families live within a context of a historical, a social, a cultural context to borrow some of our thoughts from our Wednesday night classes. Why were you laughing? Oh, you have one of those uncles. Okay, that struck a nerve. No, well, we'll compare. Yeah, right. We'll compare uncles one of these days. I bet I win. But families are unique. Families have with them a unique history. It's a little bit of an aside, but it's the closest thing I can come up with as we think about the royal families in Europe and how those families are able to trace their history back hundreds, if not thousands of years. Approximately the same time as this length of time from Adam to Noah. And so there's a sense of, pride with that, but a sense of, they point to legitimacy based on their family tree. But families are unique. There is a structure, there's a history, there's a pattern, and then families are messy, and I think this is one of the points Mark also wants us to get from our studies. Families are messy. Things do go wrong. Families do have that uncle in the background, either by failure of the role, someone failing to take the role that they should be taking. I think about our society today and how families, particularly fathers, I think, have failed to step up and be the men that God expects them to be. I think men do somehow, broadly speaking, fail to take on that God-given role. So think about, as we talk through and think about Noah, very directly think about some of the lessons that we should be bringing forward as we consider Noah and his family and how they lived, what they dealt with, how the impact of their history impacted them as a family. Okay. So, we have Noah. We have Mrs. Noah, Genesis 7:7. We have 3 sons that we're told about: Shem, Ham, Japheth, Genesis 6:10, Genesis 7:7 again. And then each of those 3 sons have wives. So this would be Noah and Mrs. Noah's daughters-in-law, Mrs. Shem, Mrs. Ham, and Mrs. Japheth. I wish I knew their names. That just seems odd, doesn't it? But we do have a definite family structure. So keep that in mind. Now, families are unique. Genesis 6, 1 through 8, we'll read that in just a second. But Noah was a man in an unrighteous world. Now, let's pause here just a little bit, because it's tempting to just dive right into Noah and think about what Noah did and how God considered Noah righteous, the only righteous, that plus his family. Therefore, God commissioned Noah to build this ark and save Noah because of his righteousness. It's tempting to just dive right in, but sometimes we understand the light by also understanding the darkness, if you see where I'm going here. So think about everyone else on earth except Noah's family. We can trace all of that back to a common starting point with Adam and Eve and their sons, daughters, as they were fruitful and populated the earth. Obviously, something went terribly wrong over the course of those generations. I was thinking about, how do you, Joe?
Back up just 1 second.
Yes.
The wife, and you wish you knew the name of that, and his daughter-in-laws. That could be a message from God there. You can be great, and you don't get the credit in the eyes of the public, but they're still there. They're a critical part of the public. You know, we're taught as we're doing good not to do it to be seen. And I think about that a lot from their standpoint. And we see that in a lot of places in the Bible, that there are people that we might hear the name one time, but you don't hear nothing else about them. But you know they did great things for God.
So if you couldn't hear Joe, he pointed out correctly that we may not know their name, but that in no way diminishes what they did, in this case, in terms of acting righteously before God. It's not to our glory, it's always to God's. Yeah. Good point. Good point. So let's think about everyone else. And I was, again, obviously something went terribly wrong over the course of those generations, right? We know where those generations ended up relative to God and God's displeasure, except for Noah and his son, his wife, his sons, and his daughters-in-law. As we think about today, right, how do we maybe relate more to the world than to Noah? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking. And I can come up with only 3 or 4 alternatives. Something got lost in translation along the way. Either there was an understanding of God and his expectations and a reverence toward God that we see in Noah. But there was an understanding at one point, and that simply became lost over time. Or, over time, it had simply just faded away, so that by the time we get near Noah's generation, there simply is no thought of God. Very close cousins, those two ideas. Or the third one is that, like Noah, everyone else knew God, but they chose to reject God. And the key word there is chose. It's an intentional decision. Let's go to 2 Peter chapter 2. It gives us a little bit of insight. 2 Peter 2, verse 5. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. That gives us some insight. It's an important verse because that tells me that Noah is trying to share what God has in mind. Noah is heralding that message of God. So, again, part of the purpose of our conversation here tonight is to think about what does this mean for us? And 2 Peter 2, verse 5 begs the question, if we are somehow like the world at the time of Noah, are we somehow intentionally turning a blind eye to the message of God that we should be paying attention to?
Just a thought on that. When you go back to Genesis chapter 6, it gives you another insight on that people chose not to do exactly what God wanted to do. Because when you go to verse number 5, it says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent and thoughts of his heart were evil continually." Like, they had the option to follow God, but they chose not to follow in righteousness.
They chose not to follow. Right. Yeah. Excuse me. When our boys were younger, we would jokingly say, when you grow up, and if my kids were here, they would be rolling their eyes completely. When you grow up and have your own job and your own money, then you get to make your own decisions, right? And the point of that, other than to kind of get under their skin a little bit and remind them that I was in charge until they grew up and have their own job and their own money, but the point was summarized in the word intentional. I would tell my kids, as a parent, what's one thing that scares you the most? Your kids driving, right? It's a terrifying thought. But I remember telling my boys, instead of telling them, be careful, when I thought about it, I would tell them, be intentional when you drive. Or as they now have their own jobs and their own money, I do sometimes say, remember to be intentional. And this is what, thank you for the verse that you read, William, because this is what God is really trying to get us to understand, right, as we think about the world and set Noah aside for a second, right? He does want us to be intentional. And now let's turn back to Noah. There was something about Noah that prompted him not only for himself to remember God, but then to love his family so much that he taught his children, who then chose wives whose heart was inclined to have reverence for God. Noah's wife had a heart that was inclined to have reverence for God. It has to come back, in my mind, it has to come back to this word intentionality, as we compare the entire rest of the world with Noah and Noah's family. Noah made a decision. Now, in my mind, I would love to say, where in the family tree did that move Noah to maintain his reverence for God? And it didn't, right? Because if it had, there would have been somebody other than Noah and his family on the ark. God would have saved them. God didn't. God destroyed every living creature that was walking the earth. So that intentionality had been lost. But I still have to contend that it was a choice. It was a choice. And I think that if there's one idea that we should take from our study tonight, it's that idea of intentionality as we live our own lives. Okay. Genesis 6:5, wickedness of man, evil continuously, filled with violence. Genesis 6:13. We already read 2 Peter 2:5, Noah, a preacher of righteousness, moved with godly fear. Let's go to Hebrews 11:5. Almost there. I'll start with verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. You know, Rocky pointed out, I think, an important takeaway tonight in his comments. Noah, like Abraham actually, took God at his word as a matter of faith. Noah built this ark according to God's specific direction. I think as a matter of faith. Hebrews here uses the word reverent fear. In reverent fear, out of reverence for God and what God was directing him to do, he, and I'm going to insert the word here, he chose to build this ark out of gopher wood. So long, so wide, so many decks. William?
The faith of Noah, on top of that, thinking about it, it never rained before. Now you know flood's coming, so on top of that, you're going to build a boat when you haven't seen something that God says is going to take place. So that takes a lot as well to deal with that. And so people, sure, when he was talking about that, made fun of him, laughed at him, ridiculed him. What are you talking about? We've never seen what is rain. Mm-hmm. But when it came to the reality of that happening, I'm sure they really wanted to reconsider, but it's too late.
It was too late, yeah. If you couldn't hear William, he recognized that Noah was building this ark, the earth having never experienced rain up to that point. And so as Noah's building this big boat, no doubt people looked at him kind of strange and wrote him off as a lunatic. But then when the rain started, they no doubt changed their minds, but it was too late. Rocky?
In verse 2 of Genesis chapter 6, I think that's key to understanding what happened too. It says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now, this isn't dumping on women, but what this is saying is that there was people who were serving God, and they began choosing for their mates people who weren't interested in serving God because they were focused on their physical beauty. And that's where it is significant that's there. That's where it all started, because there was a pulling away, a tugging away of God's people by people who didn't care about God. Because I think there's a lot of things, the Bible doesn't tell us, but, you can see there's always been a line of prophets during the Old Testament days of telling people what to do. And you already mentioned, Noah being a creature of righteousness. That was God showing his long-suffering and his mercy there by having Noah calling the people, trying to bring them back up to the last moment. But then you read in Jude how Enoch was a prophet, and you look at what he prophesied, that seemed to be, he was prophesying of God's coming destruction. And then in Luke chapter 11, which is something we might not think about much, Jesus talking there, he says in verse 50 and 51, he talks about that all the blood of the prophets that were shed from the foundation of the world, that's going all the way back to the beginning of time, might be required of this generation, from the blood of Abel unto the blood of Zechariah. So he's including Abel as a prophet of God. So God has always had his spokesman, but people stopped listening, and more people stopped listening. And one other thing to consider about this, people lived such a long time, and they spoke the same language. I mean, we saw God had to confuse the languages later to act as a barrier so that sin couldn't communicate as quickly, so it couldn't spread as fast. But think, sin is a learned behavior. And think about if you went up to be 800, 900 years old, how good you would get at it. And there was no end to it. It's not like us, we live 70, 80, 90, we die, and that's the end of all the good or all the evil that we can do. But if we're only a tenth of the way through our life, think of how evil we could actually get. And that's something to consider. So the fact that, to me, when I look at this, I understand what you're saying, but this is God waiting to the very last moment before he destroys everybody, because he's waiting to the point where, okay, if they kill Noah and his family, there's nobody righteous on the earth now, and I can't fulfill my promise that I made to mankind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You think about Sodom and Gomorrah being the same way. I mean,
Exactly.
Abraham pleaded, if I can just find 10 righteous, God said, if you find 10, I'll spare them. Of course, we know he couldn't. God is long suffering. I mean, Noah preached for 120 years, I think is the number I remember. That's 120 years of Noah saying, look at what you're doing. Think about the decisions that you're making. Turn away from that lifestyle. Turn away from that mentality. 100+ years. Again, I come back to the word intentional. Right? Not to overuse the word, but I come back to the word intentional. Noah had to be very intentional in rejecting the pressure that surely was being put on him as he built this ark. And on the other side of that coin, everyone else had to be equally as intentional in rejecting Noah's plea.
Years. They had to endure it for hundreds of years, and think of the challenge of that.
I mean, Adam was 930 when he died. I mean, Noah was 500 when he had kids. I mean, he's a late bloomer. But.
It's interesting too. When you started, you went through kind of the outline of the whole quarter with family structure, and then you get down to the family's messy and different pieces you went through. You see that through the generations as well here. And when we were in Hebrews, you read that Noah is eighth from Adam. That has significance. You don't necessarily need to go there, but Noah wasn't the anti-type, of Christ. His forefathers, Lamech died 5 years before, if you do the math. Methuselah died in the flood. I mean, essentially, and we don't know that for certainty, but we know through the math. And I think the Bible is very specific because it says, that, I'll just read this because I think this is worthwhile to go through. In all the days of Methuselah lived about, after he begat Lamech, 782 years. And then Lamech lived 182 years. And why does that matter? Because Noah was 600 when the ark came. And that's exactly 782. And I say that to say, you're talking about intentionality of family. Well, all this they had to have known. Enoch was taken, we read it in Hebrews, you read it. And I think you read Enoch for a reason. You didn't just go straight to Noah for a reason, I suspect. Well, why? Because Methuselah's dad was taken by God. Pretty sure he knew that, right? Pretty sure Noah knew that too. And so you have this generational gap where great follower of God takes him. Next one clearly is evil because Noah was around at the same time, and you establish that Noah is a herald of truth. Well, what does that mean? That means he's a preacher. He was preaching for 120 years, as you were saying, and yet, his grandfather didn't come. And so you see this generational thing of, there's people who choose to not go with what they know, and clearly they knew about God. They chose not to. And then you have others who choose to see the world in what God's built and recognize God's existence in his ultimate authority. And I just find that fascinating because Methuselah is stuck in between Enoch and Noah. And yet, he wasn't on the ark. We know he was evil because he wasn't in the ark.
Right.
That's a long-winded way of saying, but it kind of fits with your structure. There's great legacies of families, but there's also some messiness in there. And to your point, what can we do? We can be that intentional dedication to God and in the Christian age, Christ, which is our whole duty.
Which is our whole duty, yeah. There's a lot more we could talk about. There's Noah cursing Canaan after Ham sees Noah drunk and naked, and Shem and Japheth cover Noah. Ham does not. If you want an interesting read, go Google that. There's all kinds of speculation with that. We won't go into it, we're out of time, but I hopefully pique your curiosity. There is a lot there with that. But it's interesting. Noah curses Canaan, not Ham. And nowhere, as far as I can see in the text, is it God cursing Noah or Ham or Canaan. It's Noah cursing Canaan. But we're out of time. I'll just mention it. You can pursue that on your own study. Any final comment? Any final thoughts? Very well. Thank you.